Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating, the Vice President of Product Strategy here at Zimperium, and we would like to welcome you to another webinar. This one is on the fact that we are the first, Zimperium is the first and only MTD solution that has received gone through the process and the hurdles to become FedRAMP ATO. So we'd like to talk a little bit about the threats that the world is facing, a little bit about Zimperium, and then dive into the cloud. I'm joined today by Tim Perro, who's our Director of Customer Success in the public sector here in the United States. And he was a key part of driving this whole process. So Tim, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Good morning.
So we're going to run through this. We're going to try and keep it to 20-25 minutes worth of content. Please use the Q&A section. We'll have a session at the end to answer any questions you have. If there are no questions, then we don't make them up. We're not one of those companies. We will give you some time back, but if there are questions, of course, we would love to address them for you. I'm always wanting to make sure that you guys know about some of the other stuff going on next week. In fact, on the 31st, we're going to be doing our first half mobile security, the State of Enterprise Mobile Security report. And so we've got a webinar next Wednesday. If you're interested in the report and or the webinar going through the key findings, based on about 45 million endpoints, we have data from the first half of the year, and we're going to break it down and talk about the different threats to give you some visibility. So I suggest paying attention to that if you're interested. And then also please follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, all the rest of that stuff, so you can stay on top of the mobile security thoughts and trends. So with that, let us dive in to this conversation. Our agenda, which we had put on the abstract, first, kind of why do we even care? Why do you need to protect mobile devices against these attack vectors? Two, why are our solutions consistently chosen to protect devices around government agencies? We're not going to, this is not a product presentation, so we're not going to dive into the nuances. Obviously, if people are interested, we're more than happy to do demos and everything with you after the fact, but it's mostly just kind of framing it up. And then specifically talking about Zimperium Federal Cloud and the ATO authorizations. So to start off with, a key critical point for everybody to understand is this: an endpoint is an endpoint is an endpoint. If you have agency data sitting on a laptop, it's no different if you've got that exact same data sitting on a mobile device. An endpoint is an endpoint. 2 years ago, all the mobile security engagements we were a part of were driven by mobility. Last year and this year going forward, they're almost all endpoint security teams that are the ones driving it. In a typical agency, in a typical enterprise, about 40% of the endpoints are traditional endpoints that we put traditional EPP solutions onto. 60% are mobile and 60% have no visibility. So that's obviously a key to this entire thing, is the endpoint side. And these endpoints are under attack. If you spend any time looking at the press now, I kind of liken this to the minute somebody shows you the arrow and the FedEx logo, you can never unsee it. Now that you start talking about mobile security, you'll see that it's literally all over the place. And every time you turn around, you're going to see another story about mobile security, devices being compromised like Mr. Bezos, et cetera, et cetera. So you're going to see this every place. The attacks are different. And again, this webinar is really focused on the FedRAMP ATO part, but you kind of need to have the framework of what's going on. Because mobile is different than traditional endpoints, for instance, all apps are in containers, the attack vectors are different. Whereas we were very focused on malware on traditional endpoints, that was because malware, an app could interact with other apps. And so they would go sideways like a wildfire to go. The laws of security still play in mobile, one of which is persistence. The bad guys are good at what they do. They've got a business model. And for as long as they've been doing this, once they take over a device, they want to remain persistent on that device for as long as possible, whether it's a server, point of sale, now mobile. Because mobile is architected differently, like apps being in containers in the hardened kernel of the operating system, the only real way to be persistent and survive and be able to continue to use it as a launching point from a land and expand is to actually compromise the device. So that is the ultimate goal. Elevate privileges, elevate access, compromise the device, and you can be persistent. Malicious apps are untargeted fraud. Can they deliver an exploit? Yes, but it's not the most efficient way to be able to target somebody. And when you talk about agencies that are FedRAMP ATO focused, they're going to be targets. So if I'm going after an agency as a bad guy, I'm not going to drop an app in the App Store and hope that agency downloads it. It's a bad business model. Phishing is a real issue on mobile for a variety of different reasons. We'll be spending much more time on phishing going forward in different webinars. But basically, 90% of breaches start with phishing, and 2/3 of emails are read on mobile. And mobile has a different form factor, smaller screen size, all these things to make it easier. And most people use their mobile devices for personal and professional. It doesn't matter what corporate phishing protection we've put into our email filters on the personal side. So on a personal side, I could get phished, hit a website, exploit could be delivered to again compromise the device. But Zimperium is built from the very beginning to protect agencies and enterprises, not to protect consumers. So we knew targeted attacks were what we needed to start with. The most efficient way to target an agency is not to drop an app in the App Store, cast a wide net in phishing. It is to set up a fake Wi-Fi network near one of those agency locations, wait until you find somebody from that agency, and immediately compromise the device. Our data bears this out, that 90% of targeted attacks start with a network attack. Now, you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with FedRAMP? Well, when we get into the solution you need, you have to account for these facts. And like I said, next week, going into deep dive on all the various different threats. The goal's still pretty obvious: credentials, data, weaponization. The only way you can actually do the weaponization, again, is to truly compromise the device. So with that as a foundation, we'll talk about Zimperium briefly to set up the ATO discussion. Coming back to this, looking at this from a different perspective, not just the intellectual side of the data, what this says is 9 times out of 10, the bad guy owns the network. And so if the bad guy owns the network, we knew from the very beginning, again, protecting agencies and enterprises, that you're going to have to do all your detection on device. If you do all your detection in the cloud, the very first thing the bad guy does, 9 times out of 10, when he owns the network, is terminate your ability to get to that cloud. So you need to be able to do your detection on device. Management, policy setting, integrations, EMMs, all of that can be done in the cloud. But as far as the actual detection ability, it's got to be on device. And as you can see, Gartner has even talked about that now. On-device agent, better likelihood of protection. If you actually talk to the analysts, they're much stronger in their terminology than this, in terms of their belief that protection, if it's up in the cloud, can be basically cut off completely. So based on that, since we're designed to do this in the first place, Zimperium has one engine, and it's called Z9. Z9 is a machine learning-based engine, because part of targeted attacks is you need to be able to prevent brand new attacks that have never been seen before. You need to be able to detect those as well. So it's trained in the lab against billions of data points, tens of millions of endpoints, like we're talking about in the threat report. Once we figure out what are the right things that change whenever we see a device attack, network attack, phishing, or malicious apps, we create what's called a classifier. That little classifier is what goes down on device. So we're not doing machine learning on device, because that would take a lot of processing power. That's what the lab is for. What we're doing is machine learning-based detection on device. So it's very fast, very efficient, and can survive and function even when the bad guys own the network. So Z9 undergirds 2 different types of protection. If you are trying to protect your device and all the data that's on your device 100% of the time, like EPP, endpoint protection platforms have been, next generation antivirus platforms have been on traditional endpoints, you would use a product that we have called ZIPS, which stands for Z Intrusion Prevention System. If, however, you have mobile apps, we have an SDK where you can drop Z9 directly inside of those mobile apps. Now, one example is a major bank using ZIPS to protect its employees, using ZApp to protect not only its mobile banking users, but also BYOD initiatives where they actually have internal enterprise apps. So in that case, again, let's say for privacy reasons and stuff, it's a different form factor, a different approach. One of the huge advantages of doing all of our detection on device is that we don't have to lock our console, which is called Z-Console, onto any particular cloud. People that are doing cloud-based detection have to lock those two things together. So we are completely cloud agnostic. We don't care what cloud people go on. Obviously, we're going to talk about right after this is AWS GovCloud, FedRAMP, and that side of things. But the reason I've taken you through this is to explain architecturally kind of how we got there. And then as Tim was going to be talking a little bit about from a FedRAMP standpoint, these things all flow in together, right? We're not spending a ton of time on this. We just got finished doing an RFP, the 5 must-have sections of a mobile security RFP. You can watch those webinars or download the PDFs for that. But you need to integrate in with EMMs. We integrate in with the biggest set of EMMs. We're the only ones that can actually have multiple EMMs in the same console. Once we have any of this data, we can put it into any SIM. We believe we need to fit into the enterprise world, not the enterprise needs to fit into our world. I kind of joke that it's kind of like the hamburger, the old hamburger commercial about have it your way. You guys should be able to have it your way. Behind Z-Console is a capability called Z3A, which is advanced app analysis. There's perfectly legitimate apps that are in your environment. Malicious apps are already detected by Z9, but there's perfectly legitimate apps that have security and privacy risks in them. Because when apps are created, developers will go out and just grab libraries and SDKs from all over the place and throw it in their app without realizing, for instance, that it's sending traffic to a foreign country. One of the things in the webinar next week, little baby teaser, 1/4 of iOS apps send sensitive data off the device unencrypted. So you need to know about these things so you can set policies against them. So with all of that being said, the FedRAMP side of things is all about the cloud. And it's all about if an agency wants to use a cloud-based service, what are the, how can they know, and is there any way of being able to accelerate the ability to have a vetted solution? So Zimperium, as I mentioned at the onset, is the only MTD solution today that is FedRAMP ATO. And as I mentioned, Tim was part of driving that process. So Tim, could you maybe just start off and just kind of explain, because one of the things I thought was interesting as we've gone out and talked, I think a lot of the kind of the high-end agencies, the high-side agencies, they're all totally familiar with FedRAMP. Some of the more civilian agencies would like to be able to take advantage of it, but sometimes we're finding that they're not even really sure what it is. So can you just give us a feel for what is FedRAMP before we get into our side?
Sure. So good morning. So FedRAMP, right? Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program. And, their coin phrase is do once and use many times. And that's an important key factor for agencies moving to the cloud, right? So somebody else, and specifically for Zimperium, our sponsor is DHS ICE, and our cloud is ZFC, which is Zimperium's federal cloud, and that can be found on FedRAMP's marketplace, right? So that's marketplace.fedramp.gov, and you would just do a keyword search on Zimperium, and you'd be able to find our package. So that do once and use many times, that framework is because DHS and ICE, as our sponsor, has gone through the risk assessment and analysis of our cloud infrastructure. And the process for ourselves, right, took about 12 months, 13 months. So our kickoff was in June of last year. We received our ATO July 2nd of this year. So that was a very good day for Zimperium. And I think this, and as well as the marketplace, right? So only mobile threat defense product in the federal government today that's ATO. And as an organization, as a company, it was a tremendous amount of investment to be able to go through this process and to work through the 18 different control families that make up the FedRAMP security process, right? And so a very heavy lift for the company. And then a lot of thanks to our sponsor, DHS ICE, And essentially what we do is we go through the architecture and they accept that risk. They review our security controls that were presented. It goes through the FedRAMP PMO, and it's assessed by the JAG, which is made up of DoD and GSA and CIOs across the industry or across the government space, and then they go and they make that ATO once it's approved. And so
if I can, let me ask you a few questions. And by the way, we do have a slide in here which will kind of give a little bit of snapshot of what Tim was talking about in terms of the package name and the like. But here's some of the questions that we've kind of run through. And so we figured probably one of the best ways of doing this is if the agencies we're already talking to are asking some of these questions, then there's probably folks that are on the webinar that are asking these questions. So is FedRAMP mandatory? And if so, for whom?
it is. It's mandatory for all government agencies that go to the cloud. And so if you're going to be in that cloud space, right, it's essentially any cloud deployment needs to be approved as FedRAMP. And if it's not, if you go through and it's not, then an agency would need to do a quarterly report through Portfolio Stat, and they would list any cloud service that they have within their environment and provide the rationale for why it's not, and then also propose solutions as to achieving compliance.
Got it. So it's kind of like when we talk about being able to operate on any cloud, right? When we go into pretty much any institution, if they're let's say a complete Azure shop, and if a solution is only on AWS, they can find a way of getting authorization and approval and everything, but it's painful, time consuming. You have to document why you're going outside of the corporate compliance side of things. So it's similar here. There are ways around it, but it definitely violates the cut once, used many times, and it just makes it a lot more difficult because, like I said, 18 different control families that had to be run through. Right. Yeah. Okay.
And that represents out of the gate probably 1,250 different variables across those 18 control families.
Wow. So it is a significant investment as well.
It's a tremendous investment. And so, and think of it this way, each cloud infrastructure that's built in service that's provided, they span across those 18. So you don't adhere essentially to all 18 because it's particular to the type of service that you're providing to the government.
Got it.
But that's encompassing, that's kind of the big picture, is there are 18 control families and some 1,200 controls right out of the gate that you have your architecture would apply to.
You know, the other thing that's interesting for me, it's not one of these questions, but just out of curiosity, this must have been a decent amount of energy and work on the part of DHS and ICE as well.
Absolutely.
What is in it for an agency to, I mean, clearly there's the overall good, but a lot of times any given agency has got enough on their own plate without having to worry about greater good.
Right.
What is a motivation? And I know maybe not necessarily for them, but what is a motivation of an agency to help in a process like this? Because it sounds like it's a lot of heavy lifting.
It is. It's a tremendous lift for the agency, and they're oftentimes understaffed and overwhelmed and do more with less, right? And so that's really one of the key benefits of FedRAMP is the fact that DHS ICE has gone through this assessment of our specific cloud infrastructure, and they've accepted the risk associated to all of those control families and variables that roll up into those control families, and then they've approved it. And so essentially for any other government agency, they can go to marketplace.gov and pull down our package, right? Mm-hmm. They assess that package, the same control families that we were ATO'd through. They can assess that architecture, accept the risk, and then essentially issue a letter back to the FedRAMP PMO that provides ATO, again, for their agency. Mm-hmm. So instead of having to go through that year-long process and look at our cloud infrastructure and how it applies to their environment, mm-hmm. they already have a package that's baked. They pull it down, they review it, If they so choose to make some adjustments to that package, you can't take away, but you can add. So if there are different or additional controls that they would like, they can add that, and then they write that into their letter, and then essentially that goes back to FedRAMP.
Got it. So when you were talking about not everybody would necessarily have all the 18, if DHS and ICE had some subset of those, and somebody came along and said, well, there's one thing I do want, then they could add to it, but they can't take away.
Correct.
Got it. Perfect. So what is the difference between FISMA and FedRAMP?
And so, FISMA and FedRAMP are both based on NIST security package 800-53 security controls. And that's based on revision 4's baseline. FedRAMP is specific to cloud infrastructure, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's over and above the NIST baseline, and they address the unique elements of cloud.
Got it.
And that's the purpose of essentially FedRAMP.
Got it. Perfect. And then, as I understand it, there's 3 different levels of FedRAMP. There's FedRAMP Ready when somebody first comes in, then there's FedRAMP in Process, and then there's FedRAMP-authorized. Mm-hmm. What is the distinction between those 2 poles? And then the next question we'll talk about in Process. But what is the difference between FedRAMP Ready and FedRAMP ATO? Right.
So sure, let's talk about that for a minute. The main distinction is that FedRAMP Ready is not a FedRAMP-authorized solution. In short, FedRAMP Ready systems must still undergo authorization process, while FedRAMP authorized systems have essentially completed the process, and at least they've gone through, and that process is completed.
So FedRAMP Ready, it seems at the very beginning of the whole process, it seems like we were FedRAMP Ready for a hot minute.
Right.
It was like almost like you put in the paperwork, right, and then you almost immediately move over to the next one, which is FedRAMP in Process, that middle category.
Correct.
So is FedRAMP in Process, literally living up to its name, where you're in process of trying to go through all the different 18 controls and get it checked, authorized, validated, verified, but you're just kind of in the middle of it, right?
You are, and FedRAMPs, if you go out and take a look at some of their documentation, their goal today is 6 to 12 months for that process to go through. So as an agency, if you would look at it to do it on your own and issue your own ATO with a cloud service provider, that's what you can expect. It's about a year-long effort, anywhere between 6 months to a year-long effort. We did it in about 13 months, right on track following the FedRAMP process. As you get through, you work internally with FedRAMP's agency and with their agency advocates and whatnot. Once you get through 2/3 through this, you end up having what's called a 3PAO, right? The third-party assessing organization.
Okay.
And what they do, they're an independent organization, not beholden to you, but as an assessing organization for FedRAMP. And they come in and independently validate and verify all of the security controls that you have defined in your security plan, in your system security plan, what's called the SSP, which is a large document for receiving the ATO. Essentially everything that you do about your architecture resides in that system security plan.
So are these, you mentioned the auditors, third-party agencies were not beholden to us. You mentioned that they work for FedRAMP. So does that mean they're also not beholden to the sponsor? Is it
correct? So
it's a true,
right. They're an independent third-party assessing organization. So right. So they pivot. So they come in and they essentially review the architecture of the cloud service provider, and then they pivot and they do a report, and they provide that report back to FedRAMP, and then you sit down with the FedRAMP PMO and the 3PAO, and you go through your system security plan, literally all of your control families, and your sponsor, and the sponsor talks about, this is what I would like to maybe see changed. You need to do a little bit of homework here. You need to tighten this control. And that's kind of a process that you go through.
Got it.
Once you vet that out, then it goes back to FedRAMP's organization. You resubmit, and then they do their they do another analysis, then they award, or they could potentially, that could go on for a while, or if they're good with the risk that you associate to your architecture, then they issue you an ATO.
So to a certain extent, it sounds like the FedRAMP process, very, very stringent in terms of the 18 controls. You have to have a sponsor, so you can't just, throw yourself into the mix.
Correct.
But in some ways, to simplify it into something we're all very familiar with, it sounds like in terms of these different stages, it's very similar to compliance audits. Like in process means you're being audited.
That is true.
ATO means you pass the audit.
Correct.
Okay. So but the cool thing is, it's almost like if extending this metaphor, that you pass the audit. I pass the audit as an agency. I'm ICE, right? So I pass my audit. But what's cool is the fact that I passed my audit for this particular part of thing, the cloud infrastructure, you can now benefit from. So Correct. You can actually pass the audit right off the bat by using the same solution.
Correct. So you're another civilian agency within the federal government, and you want to use Zimperium product. You would go to FedRAMP marketplace.gov. You would download that package. You'd review, essentially pull down our system security plan, right? Mm-hmm. And basically review that SSP. And then if you need to add controls to that, we will work with you in that space, and then submit back to FedRAMP. So you don't have to do the heavy lifting as the agency. DHS ICE has already done that for you. Also keep in mind that just because Zimperium received their ATO, it doesn't just stop there. There's also what's called ConMon, right? So continuous monitoring. That goes on forever. It goes on for the life, as long as our architecture and our Zimperium package is a cloud service. So there's continuous monitoring that goes on annually. And then there's also things as you work through that continuous monitoring process, they have what's called a POAM, plan of action and milestones. So as you work through your architecture, and there may be some changes to it, right? Mm-hmm. You would move those things to your POAM. They're approved by your sponsor. You meet on a monthly cadence, typically. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a process.
Cool. So it's not just a one-time stamp, and then somebody comes rolling in a year from now, and it's totally different.
Right. Not at all. And essentially, Zimperium as an organization and a cloud service provider, we cannot change anything in that architecture at this point unless it's now approved by DHS ICE.
Got it.
They essentially have approved that risk. That risk can't change. That architecture cannot change unless the customer themselves.
Got it. So it's like a change process in development.
That is correct. It's change management boards and everything. So it's very formalized. And it's, I have to commend FedRAMP and what they've done in the last year and a half, the last 2 years, with their agency advocates and as much information that they published out in the FedRAMP marketplaces. They've done a super job.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. One of the things we just want to kind of finish off on, then we're going to have questions. One of the things people have been asking us about is the federal government has been the agencies in the federal government across civilian, defense, intelligence. We have dozens of customers at this point in time, and a lot of them have actually enabled sole source acquisition. And so just kind of finish out what are some of the capabilities we've got that have delivered the ability to do sole source acquisition. First is the machine learning detection of all three in a single engine. Second, we're the only ones of the majors that do it on device 100% of the time. We are the most enterprise ready and friendly. It's a big bucket that covers everything from multiple EMMs, cloud independence, on-prem if you want it, all the rest of that stuff. Our forensics is something, the level of forensic detail that we pull in, because again, we were focused on the enterprise. We weren't focused on consumers and tried to pivot. And then now, then we have an SDK, as I mentioned, ZApp, if you have some apps that you want to be able to embed protection in. And then, of course, now, being the fact that we're the only solution that's FedRAMP ATO. So with that, we're going to stop for a second, and we're going to see if anybody has any questions. And again, just a reminder, if you're interested in the mobile threat space, please register for the webinar that we're doing next week, where we're doing the global state of mobile enterprise security webinar. So I do not see any questions. So Tim, thank you very much again for joining me on this, and great work on working with the FedRAMP guys.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And thank you, everybody. Have yourself a great day.